Good afternoon. Welcome to Broadband Breakfast Live Online for Wednesday, December 15th, 2021. I am Drew Clark. I'm very happy to welcome all of you to join us, whether you're watching us on Zoom in the room or whether you're on one of our other platforms, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, or otherwise. We're really happy to welcome all of you to this discussion. Just a few words about Broadband Breakfast and about our program, Broadband Breakfast Live Online. We're here every Wednesday at 12 noon Eastern time. We do this at this time so we can get everyone from the east of North America to Hawaii, and we have had Hawaii on our programs in the past. We've been doing this since the start of the pandemic, but we of course are very eager to continue even as the pandemic is beginning to be in the rearview mirror. And in fact, one of the things I wanted to make sure to highlight for everyone is we are rolling forward with in-person events on the second Wednesday of every month. We've now been doing this at Clyde's of Gallery Place. So we'll still be doing the online component. We're going to be live online every Wednesday at 12 noon. But for the second Wednesday of each month, we're going to be in person for those of you in Washington. So we encourage those of you who are in Washington to register and join us. We were able to meet last week with the head of the Minority Broadband Program at the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, Scott Woods, as well as Jace Wilson of Broadband.money, a new service allowing grant applicants to facilitate and streamline their applications. And so we will be in person at Clyde's of Gallery Place on January 12th, February 9th, March 9th. We encourage you to mark your calendar and plan for that. I also want to take a quick moment to thank our sponsors. We couldn't do these programs, both the live and the in-person, without our support from our sponsors. Let me just mention them by name, and you can see them all at broadbandbreakfast.com/sponsor, but they include Utopia Fiber, Lit Communities, Broadband.money, Broadband Now, Powerhouse Management, Samsung, Electronics America, Render Networks, Positron Access, and the California Emerging Technology Fund. So thank you to our sponsors. And I want to just quickly mention that we are going to be next week live online with a topic about broadband mapping. The week after, we have our end of the year holiday party where we're going to hear from exciting developments around the country. And then on January 5th, we'll have a live report from CES in Las Vegas. One of our reporters will be out at the Consumer Electronics Show. That's what it used to be called, covering it for us. So now, without further ado, let's turn to the subject at hand. We are talking about partnerships, and specifically public-private partnerships as they apply to broadband projects. This has really been a subject close to many of our panelists' heart, close to my heart. I'm an attorney as well as one of our panelists, and I've tried to look at this from the perspective of the cities, from the perspective of private companies, and from the perspective of the partnership itself and what it takes to make it happen. We're going to turn next to this panelist, Jim Baller, who in some ways needs no introduction. Jim is a partner at Keller and Heckman and has been the leading voice for municipalities that want to develop broadband projects over the years. I got to know and work quite closely with Jim when he founded the U.S. Broadband Coalition, a diverse group fostering consensus on the need for a national broadband strategy. And we saw the emergence of a national broadband strategy. And I think the last 8, 10, 12 years have really given us a great foundation for what we're seeing now with the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. The reason I'm highlighting Jim, and we'll turn to him just in a second, is because I too have thought through different aspects of the partnerships. Jim is going to, I'm certain, lay out some of the thinking. And you can see on the page for this event links to several of the works he's done and a piece I have done about Utopia Fiber and its various roles in public-private partnerships. And I think at the risk of going on a little too long, I just want to say that public-private partnership can be overused. It can be overused in the sense that any private company that is building a broadband network needs to have a public-private partnership in order to get permits to operate. But I think obviously we want to go deeper than that. What are the specific roles that are most appropriate for a municipality? What are the roles that are most appropriate for a private company, an offer of retail service? In some ways, I kind of view, and this is my take, definitely not necessarily Jim Fowler's take, but I have come to view the open access model as really a key facilitator of public-private partnerships. Because one of the things about an open access model is one entity owns the asset and another entity offers services. You can even have a three-tiered open access model where one entity owns the assets, another entity operates the network, and a third offers retail services. And those particular roles might be best suited. A municipality may be a great owner of assets. It may be a great facilitator of rights of way. It may not be a great operator of retail services. Then again, it might be as well. I don't want to prejudge that question, but in my mind, and again, this is Drew Clark speaking, not any of our panelists. I see the open access model being a great way to establish and get at the public-private partnership equation in broadband. So with that personal introduction, I want to turn now to our three panelists. Let me go ahead and open it up to each of them. Jim Ballard, I've already mentioned just a bit about. He also was a consultant to Google's Fiber for Communities project and is the co-founder and president of the Coalition for Local Internet Choice, which works to remove barriers to local governments making critical infrastructure decisions. After Jim speaks, we're going to hear from Dwight, but he goes by Doc Weininger. And Doc has worked on telecommunications policy issues since the 1980s. First as the executive director of the Nebraska Public Service Commission, and then for private sector providers. Currently, he is the key person at Allo Fiber responsible for local, state, and federal government relations, and he's heading up the market development into Arizona. So really, really look forward to what Doc will tell us about the practical experience of implementing public-private partnerships. And then our last panelist also needs not as much an introduction, a little bit, but not as much because Roger Timmerman is really, I would have to say the guy behind Utopia Fiber's turnaround. I mean, you go back 10 years ago, even 8 years ago, Utopia was a 4-letter word in Utah. And having lived there, I can experience this firsthand, but it is not anymore, by no means. And in fact, Roger, as the executive director of Utopia Fiber since 2016, has been a technology management professional in this industry for more than 15 years. He has worked with Vivint Wireless, with iProvo, so he's kind of seen the government side from a city's perspective, and a network product manager for Brigham Young University. And Roger, again, will be able to speak to the real renaissance that Utopia Fiber has undergone and the various models it has deployed as it's rolled out public-private partnerships. So with that, Jim, let's turn to you for 5 minutes or so to lay out some of your thoughts on this topic.
Okay, Drew, thanks very much for the invitation and for that initial summary. I certainly agree with many of your points, and on some I don't disagree, but as we all know, it depends on the circumstances. What works in one place may or may not work in another for a variety of reasons. Well, I've been involved in public-private partnerships and more general partnerships of different kinds over the course of the last 25 years. And I've seen interest in partnerships grow dramatically. Even before the COVID outbreak, we're seeing the emergence of partnerships In May of 2017, CLIC, the organization that you mentioned before, wrote a white paper on the emerging models that we were seeing. And at that point in time, the three main areas of partnerships were on one end of the spectrum, public facilitation and private investment. This was local governments working with potential entrants to make processes easy to give access to facilities. An example would be the Kansas City welcoming of Google into their community. At the other extreme, we had the public funding and private execution model based on traditional concessionaire kind of models for transportation and other projects. An example of that would be the Kentucky Wired project in the state of Kentucky, with partnership between the Commonwealth and Macquarie. And in between were projects that were, to my mind, the most interesting of all, which involved shared investment and shared risk. An example of that was Westminster, Maryland, teaming with Ting Fiber for that project. Now, it seems that since COVID, the interest in partnerships or collaboration, public-private collaboration, has exploded. All across the country, local governments have come to realize that advanced communications networks like electric systems are platforms, drivers, and enablers of simultaneous progress in everything that matters to them, including economic development and educational opportunity and public safety, transportation, workforce development. All of these fields are advancing rapidly on their own, and they all need advanced communications to do that. So a community that doesn't have access to an advanced communication network at affordable rates, terms, and conditions is not just at risk of falling behind in the most basic communications, but in all of these areas as the world passes them by. So now we're seeing a very wide range of communities looking at numerous options for collaboration. And we're seeing communities looking for willing incumbents to work with, or new entrants, including entrants like Allo and Utopia and Ting and Underline. Co-ops are entering the field and forming new kinds of relationships with each other, with different kinds of co-ops, with communications companies. There are many communities capable, particularly communities that operate their own electric utilities, to take advantage of their resources and become their own providers. But many of those are considering public-private collaborations of various kinds. Examples of that are Huntsville working with Google, Springfield working with CenturyLink. There have been recent announcements of partnerships by Charter and AT&T and Consolidated in New England. And now, with all of that, of particular significance these days is the potential of hundreds of millions, if not even more, dollars coming into this field to create what could be a parallel of pouring lighter fluid on charcoal. And we could see projects that, even as partnerships, would have been very challenging and are still challenging, even without funding. And even with funding now, they'll still be challenging, but the funding may turn the corner on feasibility and really open the door to our country stepping forward and taking advantage of our broadband infrastructure future. And I'd just add one other personal thought. I like the concept of the public and private sectors working together and different segments of the community working together. And I hope that this will be one contributing factor to our country coming together in a way that it hasn't been in some time. Drew, I'm going to pass the torch.
Wonderful thoughts there. Thank you very much, Jim, for your remarks. Let's roll right into Doc. Tell us a little bit about Allo Fiber and how you all have approached public-private partnerships, together with specific examples of where they've been deployed thus far.
All right, thank you, Drew, and thank you also for the invitation, the opportunity to be here today. Allo is a company that maybe a lot of you are not familiar with. It was started in Nebraska in 2003 in Imperial, Nebraska on the Colorado border. We are a ubiquitous overbuilder. So we go into a community, we build the entire community and provide the triple play of services. We're an all fiber network. Everything we've built since 2003 has been fiber. So we serve, we are currently building 14 new communities, which will give us a total of 27 communities in Nebraska, Colorado, and Arizona. And of those 27 communities that we're building in, 5 have been public-private partnerships. So we have had a variety of public-private partnerships that we have done from Lincoln, Nebraska, which is our largest community that we serve with approximately 300,000 population. Lincoln started in the 1970s of putting conduit in with every road project that they did, every street project they did in the city of Lincoln. And so they found themselves in the mid-teens, 2015, 2016, with over 300 miles of conduit under the streets of Lincoln. And so Allo, in overbuilding Lincoln, worked with the city of Lincoln with their conduit network, actually helping expand their conduit network and utilizing their conduit network, which really lowered our cost and made it possible for us to be able to build a city the size of Lincoln in under 2 years. We also have public-private partnerships with Ballentine, Nebraska. Their cable provider gave 90 days notice that they were leaving the community, and Ballentine was seeking a partner, private sector partner, to come in and help. And they actually invested with their electric utility in the build and provided the strand wire and other facilities for the build that they acquired from the departing company. And then Allo leases those facilities after the investment by the local community in those facilities. In Colorado, Fort Morgan is an interesting model because Fort Morgan opted out of SB 152. If people are familiar with Colorado, in 2005, there was legislation that restricted the municipalities from being involved in providing telecommunication services, but the voters could opt out of the law. And there's close to 150 communities now that have opted out of SB 152, and Fort Morgan is one of them. And so Fort Morgan and Allo formed a partnership where Fort Morgan built the backbone fiber, and then Allo is responsible for lighting the fiber, providing the electronics, building the drops, and has a 20-year lease of that backbone fiber all the way up to, with extensions, 40 years of leases available. The fourth model that was used was Breckenridge, Colorado, which, if anybody's ever been to Breckenridge, it's at 9,600 feet, and it is on top of the mountain, and it's all rock. And it was the most expensive build that we have ever done by far. And so again, City of Breckenridge is in this case building. We're building the network, but the City of Breckenridge will pay for it, and then Allo will lease that network. And then the final model is actually Arpa funding in Kingman, Arizona. We were just awarded a grant last week, as a matter of fact, and the Kingman process was interesting. They said, we have $4 million. What can private companies do with that $4 million to get fiber to the largest audience possible. And so Allo came in and said, we will match that $4 million with $43 million of our own and build the entire Kingman area. So Kingman, New Kingman and Butler area of about 45,000 residents in the Kingman, Arizona. We will be starting that build shortly after the first of the year. But that was kind of a unique way to do it, where they said, here's the money. And you tell us what you can do with it, and then that was the response that Allo had. So those are the public-private partnerships that we worked on. We were recapitalized about a year ago, which with some pretty significant capital. So things like the Kingman project allow us to take that capital farther and to build in more locations when we can supplement the capital in an expensive area to build. And Kingman is kind of an expensive area to build for a variety of reasons. That allows us to then take the capital that we have and expand the areas that we can serve utilizing the public match. And we see a lot of that coming, a lot of possibilities for that. Between the Arpa funding, we're actually talking to some other areas about their Arpa funds, as well as the infrastructure funding that we're going to see coming down in the next year. And Arizona is next month releasing $100 million in grants for last mile fiber in Arizona. And we hope to participate in a number of different areas with that grant funding.
Well, thank you for setting the table on the real world experience. And what I love, Doc, about what you said is a provider that's willing to full-heartedly embrace the term overbuilder. That's the spirit, right? Because in Washington, at least, you hear that term so much, and it's like, an unmitigated evil in the eyes of people who say it. But wait, why is that bad? Some competition here? So very glad to hear your embrace of that term. Well, let's go now to Roger. Roger, you've got a great story to tell. Tell us the latest about, what Utopia is and what you've been doing in different cities across the state and even the West.
Thanks, Drew. It's always good to be on your show. So Utopia has done everything good and bad over the years. We've originally started up as a public effort, but it was put in the hands of a private company. So phase one was Utopia plus Dynamic City as the operator, and it didn't go well. At some point, they had $185 million of debt and basically said, we need to take this thing back public from an operations perspective and fix it. And that was really the turnaround. You give me credit for turning the thing around, and I'm like, yeah, it was a team effort. There's a lot of people involved. Our political leaders here, city managers, even the Utopia Fiber team was created really, halfway through this thing, because that's when it was not privatized but publicized. And so at that point, we did turn things around. It was basically a consortium of cities. 11 that financed projects, and it took us a while to turn the thing around and really get those to be successful. And an organization called UIA was created. So Utopia was phase one, and UIA is phase two. Everything since 2009 under UIA, and UIA has grown. It's much bigger than Utopia. We call them both Utopia Fiber. It's all us from a branding and marketing perspective. But Utopia was only ever about $185 million of projects under its umbrella. UIA has shot up. We're going past $400 million of projects, and all of those are fully sustainable. There's no subsidies. There's no taxpayer dollars funding those. We essentially go out to the public bond market and finance a project, build the network, get customers and revenues, and pay for those projects. And UIA's got a really good track record. But we've done different structures within UIA. Early days of UIA had some assessment areas, which we did in Brigham City, where the financing was backed by liens on properties that people voluntarily signed up for. That was later copied and done in Ammon, if you're familiar with that one. That was modeled after our Brigham City project. And so this really, we talk about PPP models. It's like, well, we're a little bit of a three-tier, right? It's kind of public-private partnership. As an open access system, we are a public entity. So a lot of people think we're a private company. We're not. We are a political subdivision of the state of Utah. And so it's cities that partner with us. And then we partner by building this infrastructure, and then we open that up kind of like a lease model, where the private companies come in and they use that system and they pay for transport across it. So we have 15, actually, I think we are at 16. We just added one, service providers residentially, and about 35 on the business side of things. We have fiber networks in 54 cities. We have fiber to the home citywide projects in, I'd say, it depends how you count them. As branded Utopia Fiber, I think we're at 16. We are the operator in a public-private partnerships in Idaho Falls and now Bozeman. And Bozeman is a little different. That one, same number of Ps, but you change the roles a little bit. That's a private entity, as Bozeman Fiber is a nonprofit organization that holds the ownership and the financing of that, contracting with the public entity for the operations, designs, and implementation of that system, and then opening that system up back to private partners for the services in an open access model. So those P's can go in a lot of different ways, lots of different structures. Back to Jim's point, there isn't really a one size fits all. We've had a lot of conversations with communities and what they have to bring to the table, what their needs are, and how we might fill all those roles and deliver a successful system. So with the partnerships and the announcement of 2 new city partnerships just 2 days ago, we approved 2 new partnerships with Cedar Hills City and Santa Clara City, both in Utah. That takes us up to 20 fiber to the home projects. So things are growing really well, and we're excited. We keep getting more service providers, more interest. The service providers on our network are all thriving. I mean, even though we bring on new service providers, we're increasing the size of the pie very, very quickly. Meaning we build more cities and build more footprints and expand the reach of the system very fast. And all those providers are fighting for their slice of the pie, but they're all growing with us. And so they're happy. It's a great model for them. It works great for the public partnership. None of these cities or entities that we're partnering with have the individual economy of scale and expertise to pull this off. And so by partnering with us, we're like, well, we're already doing this. It's really easy. Idaho Falls, I don't think I've even hired a single employee for that system. Whereas the city has some local resources to do the boots on the ground. We're able to manage some pretty big networks remotely and design them, do construction management, network engineering, NOC services, all that sort of stuff from our existing facilities. So we're in a position, we're growing really, really fast, keep getting new city partnerships. Obviously, we're growing regionally. We're in Idaho and Montana, and we do expect to do some partnerships in Colorado, Arizona, Nevada, are some growth territory for us, in addition to those ones we're already in. So anyways, that's us.
Yeah, no, an amazing story. And I'm so glad that we can now talk about this, right, with all of us here. And I want to actually throw my first question to Roger, but then invite Doc and Jim to take it, which is that, did I hear you right? 16 residential providers on your open access network and 35 business providers. Everyone who talks about open access, they always say, like, it's going to drive the prices way down to have so many providers. What's your take on that? I mean, you kind of addressed this already with growing the pie, but from a realistic perspective, 16, really? I mean, can they all make money off that?
It depends. I mean, it's tough, right? It's highly competitive. However, one of the interesting stats that we have is that our most expensive provider is our largest provider with the most subscribers. And so it hasn't become a race to the bottom. It's actually done the opposite, where those providers that can differentiate themselves on quality, reputation, consumer privacy has been a big issue lately. And that helps us even with the cities entirely, where some of the private options out there, we see some partnerships in Utah with other private providers, and the construction methodologies, the policy issues are very concerning for cities. They want to preserve consumer privacy and choice and competition. And so that model works in a lot of ways. It works for those service providers. They're able to come in with a very low barrier of entry, right? That's key. They say, why do I want to go in there and throw my hat in against 15 other providers? It's like, well, my costs to get on board are really low. And I can immediately have access to 150,000 addresses or so, and growing very fast. Actually, with those other out-of-state projects, I'm not counting those. And so there's a lot of territory and addresses that they can immediately go and market to and get customers at very low cost. At the same time, I don't know that 16 does much better than 15, right? I mean, if it's like, does it just make it harder for someone to sign up? It does to some extent. So we find ourselves kind of beating them off with a stick, like, let's make not the cost barrier there. We want these companies to be successful, but as far as quality, ability to deliver services, their track record and all that, we've had to raise the bar over the years to prevent, another 20, little mom and pops coming in that may be more fly by night experiments. We want well-established, successful companies because, we've got a lot on the hook, right? I said, we got, between the two phases of the project, we're up at $600-700 million of projects. I can't afford to put that asset in the hands, or at risk with some fly-by-night company. And so we work hand in hand with providers on the quality and reputation to make sure that we both win, and also that the city participants win and get what they want.
Well, Doc, what's your perspective on that? And I know I kind of throwing in an open access question here to start us off, but what is your approach to that term, Doc? And again, how do you kind of compete in those, if you do compete in markets with other providers in cities?
Well, I mean, obviously we compete with a lot of other providers, but we are not competing in any open access communities at this time. We have seen a lot of the RFPs that are being put out now in the various states that include the requirement that the network that be built be open access, which certainly is the public's going to own it. It's by its nature, I think, an open access network in a lot of these communities that are going to place the money in there. Our business model has been to build and own our own facilities, but that doesn't mean that we wouldn't, in an attractive community, enter an open access market. We just have not chosen to do so at this time. We have invested close to $700 million in private capital in the networks that we go to and have gone to, and that tends to be our business model. So I have not had a lot of experience, our company, with the open access model.
No, fair enough. And again, I'm not trying to say we need to talk only about this approach. I do raise it though, because it is a question that I hear a fair bit. And kind of leading into Jim, I mean, is the Huntsville model that you referred to, is that not an example where multiple players can operate on? What are some of your thoughts on the question of how many is too many in an open network, Jim? And you're on mute right now. So
yes.
Thank you.
So let me just start with a war story, a real live war story. A community in Washington State that had a public utility district. Once I sat in on a meeting with him in which he said, state law, after the community developed their network, prohibited public utility districts from providing retail service. So they could only provide wholesale service, which looks like an open access model. And he said, here's where I am. My success in recovering my cost depends on the success of the entities providing the retail service. I've got 19 ISPs on my network. They're killing each other. Nobody's making any money and nobody's paying me. I can't raise their rates. I can't lower their rates. What am I supposed to do? As it happens, what they did was to favor the stronger ones. And before long, the state conducted an investigation and determined that the PUD was not treating the retailers on an arm's length basis. Everyone lost their jobs, and that became an example of open access run amok. But I would love to see open access work. I just urge caution because you need to do hard analysis in the particular market. There have been examples where communities have recognized that open access may not be something that is possible up front, but it can be over time. Westminster, for a while, allowed exclusivity to Ting, which then had to open once it reached certain criteria. We've seen that in other markets. My bottom line point is you have to look at the numbers very carefully, assess what the circumstances are, and make your decision based on what's in front of you. There's no, as you said before, there's no one size shoe that fits all in these circumstances.
Great. Thank you for that reaction. I'm actually going to share a screen that I hope everyone can see. This is from a paper that Jim wrote. So I think it's very much in the strike zone for what we want to talk about here. And I don't know quite whether it's big enough, but I'm going to kind of state the bigger points here. Layer 0 and layer 1 and layer 2 are sometimes referred to as, stacks in a networking that go up to layer 7. And they refer, of course, as many of our listeners will know, to different facets of a network. And in this model that Jim and his co-author, Joanne Hovis, as well as some other colleagues have put together, he's put here an asset under a layer 0 model, a layer 1 model, and a layer 2 model, a city-county role, and then case studies. Now, again, the reason this is so applicable is because we have here West Des Moines, Lincoln, Nebraska, which I understand Allo is involved in. So you're a partner in this equation. Jim, you've obviously worked on several of these projects. You've referenced Westminster as well as Huntsville earlier on. And then, of course, we have the executive director of Utopia Fiber, and he's also referenced the Ammon model. So we have a number of these models on the board. And so I guess let me turn to you first, Jim. What are some of the, what's the value of this paradigm? And what are some of the things that community should be thinking about when it says, I think I want to get involved in a public-private partnership for broadband. I'm not sure whether I want a conduit model, a dark fiber model, or a lit circuits over fiber model. What do they do to think about this process, Jim?
Well, that's a very good question, Drew. And again, the answer will depend on the community. Typically in a broadband project, there's an inception phase in which the community champions step forward and see an opportunity there and try to learn as much about that opportunity as possible, from attending broadband breakfast and talking to people that have comparable communities and so on and so forth. And eventually they'll get a generalized feeling for what the possibilities are. And they will eventually build local support and get to the point where it's important to do more detailed analysis. In some cases, it will be obvious to the participants that a public-private partnership of some kind is likely to be an outcome. In other cases, it might not be so clear. For example, a community that has its own electric utility might have advantages over one that doesn't, and may want to explore in greater depth what it can do itself. our experience has been that communities that go as far as possible in looking at themselves, their assets, their goals, their gaps, their needs, will benefit from doing that when they get to talking and considering partnerships. Perhaps I don't want to talk too long here. Perhaps we can get back later on how to look for partnerships and identify and vet them. But the answer, I think, to your question is, this is a general framework that helps localities place themselves on the continuum of the roles that they and private entities can play and have played. It's intended to support their framing in their own minds of how to make sense of what could otherwise seem very chaotic to them. Let me also say that in this paper from which you drew this, my people were primarily responsible for the legal analysis, and we spent half the paper talking about the important legal issues that you should address at each stage of these processes. And Joanne and her team focused on the business and financial considerations from which you've drawn the table that you've shown to the group.
Well, thank you. And I know that there's a more recent paper as well. These are all linked on the page that I put in the chat window. Let me ask both Doc and Roger a similar question, but just add in another variable, which is when should a community think about a public-private partnerships, in addition to kind of how they should go about thinking about it? Doc, what would be your advice on that score?
I'd say about 2 or 3 years ago. It's moving so incredibly fast right now, and there are so many communities that still don't have the service that I think they need, the level of service that they need. And so, I think that a community needs to look at the public-private partnership concept. If in fact the service that they have, if they don't have gig service in their community, if they don't have fiber in their community, then they don't see a provider coming if nobody's talking to them, if nobody is doing the due diligence, if nobody's visiting the community. I think they need to initiate the concept of the public-private partnership now. But to do that, they have to first do exactly what Jim was talking about. What resources do they have? Do they have an electric utility that they can use? Do they have ARPA funding? Do they have other grants, state or infrastructure grants that they have access to? What do they bring to the table? How can they make it more attractive or easier for the private company to come into the community? But I think that assessment needs to be done. What is there currently? And if fiber is not available, then they need to start that process of contacting every provider that operates within, 500 miles probably, to speak with about, and ask that company. We get asked, what will it take to bring ALLO to our community? And so go ahead.
Well, so let me just ballpark it, Doc. What % of private companies like ALLO would be willing to sort of enter into a deal where they aren't owning all of the assets? I mean, again, I'm not saying you don't own the assets in some, but you have talked about scenarios where the city does own them. So what % of providers would be willing to do that?
I think it's a relatively low percent, maybe a quarter to a third that are willing to look at providing over somebody else's facilities. But I think that number is growing, particularly with the amount of public money that is currently available and will be available in the next 18 to 24 months. I think that number will grow significantly.
Yeah. Roger, what's your take on this question of when and how?
Yeah, I totally agree with Doc on 3 years ago would have probably been better. No better time than now, I guess, is if you didn't do it 3 years ago. But there's issues. I mean, if you look historically over the last 20 years, you would see a 3 to 5% increase in materials and construction. Now suddenly there's all this money available, and with inflation pressure and everything else, I think most people are looking at 20 to 30% increase in construction of fiber networks over the next year, and that's probably not going to stop there. I think the big problem is there's enormous demand, but there's not more supply, right? Nobody's turned up new fiber manufacturing plants. Those take several years to turn up. Conduit, even qualified contractors with drilling rigs and labor has gone up, and it's tough. I mean, one of the big concerns that we bring up is, we'll probably end up with the same or similar amount of construction of fiber networks, but just more money in the market, and it's just going to cost a lot more. So that's the benefit of all this new money, is people will make more money, but not much more fiber will get built. And I hope I'm wrong. That's where we're like, let's call attention to getting some of the supply chain issues resolved, getting more people trained in this work, getting more factories running with greater capacity. But even on top of that, a lot of the supply for fiber cable is being eaten up by things that used to only be telecom. We see, hyperscalers and data centers and things like that consuming a significant amount of fiber cable capacity. And you're just like, crud, now we have even more things going after the same supply. It is a concern. I mean, we've done our best to stay ahead of that and order well in advance and stock inventories as much as we can. But for a city to walk in now and just think, hey, we're going to just bond for a project and it's just going to happen, is naive. And we've seen some cities take that approach. You really need to have people who know what they're doing and who recognize these limitations and risks and these projects. Otherwise, you're going to fall on your face and have a failed project.
Right. Jim, Roger has raised a very significant obstacle. I'm wondering your thoughts on this supply chain inflation obstacle and other significant obstacles that you think might arise in developing a public-private partnership.
Drew, would you mind if I started by adding to the conversation that you kicked off with your last question?
Please do.
On the point of when and how to consider public-private partnerships, let me talk about some processes, more formal processes that local governments tend to be subject to. Now, I realize we're talking about this to a national audience, and there are different considerations from state to state. But at some point in the process, local governments will typically have to comply with procurement requirements, typically a request for proposals that has limitations on how they can vary from what they put out for bid. We've found over the years that a process of a more preliminary request for information or request for qualifications, which amounts to a community laying out what its opportunity is and what its needs are, the kinds of things that Doc and I were talking about before, puts these into a document, issues it, and invites the provider community and others to come back with their ideas. We've found over the years that communities might get confirmation of their initial impressions of what they wanted or what they were looking for. Sometimes they refine their points of view. Sometimes they're surprised they get ideas that they hadn't considered that cause significant changes. Now, in this environment where everything is speeding up, or the need for action is greater than it may have been in the past, it may be necessary to accelerate the process. RFIs and RFQs typically are not subject to extensive requirements and can be manipulated in such a way that communities can get responses earlier, but they should definitely probe the market. One important reason is that we have on this session well-established organizations that are doing well in the field, but this is an Oklahoma gold rush, and you can't always be confident if you're a community that is new to this, that what you're hearing in terms of technology, in terms of revenues, in terms of everything else is reliable, or that the provider who's giving you that information is itself reliable and has resources to follow through. So some form of process to get a sense of what your options really are, I think, is highly advisable.
Yeah. Let's let Roger and Doc speak to that question too, which is, let me just restate it. What are the processes to find a partner? Or I guess in the case of Doc, you're trying to find a city, and maybe Roger, you're trying to find cities too, but how do you view it from that end of the equation?
Our experience, it kind of comes both ways. Sometimes we see the interest, meaning, we go talk to the cities where we see the opportunity and demand. And so we'll have those conversations, and that eventually will result in an RFP. And then we don't always win those, but we usually do if they actually decide to move forward. And then sometimes it's, we weren't involved at all, and we see an RFP, our city has been kind of led to that stage. Cities rarely will just get to an RFP on their own, right? They usually have some sort of consultant or someone who's looking to promote this. And then they say, okay, this sounds great. Now, how do we make that happen? We have these procurement processes. We'll issue an RFP. And then some of them have already made up their minds, and some of them have an open mind in that process. Obviously, we think they should have an open mind and fairly score, all of the contenders. But, in Utah, we see a lot of city partnerships happening. And when an RFP is issued, it usually results in utopia. If they partner with someone else, there usually wasn't an RFP. Those are the deals that get done behind closed doors. I'm not real supportive of that from a process perspective.
What's your take on this, Doc?
A lot of different processes. We have probably 150 communities in queue that we have had some level of contact with and discussion with and analysis of. We come into a community, we seek the GIS information from the electric provider and do an initial cost analysis of what that community is going to be, and then whether that's something that we can do within, get an ROI on our own with the private investment, or whether we need to seek some type of public funding. So we have those that we initiate, but then we also respond to a lot of communities that do the RFQs, RFIs, RFPs as well, in those type of processes. So we're kind of all over the board in the processes we see and how we interact and how we initiate with the community.
I think the common core from all of us is don't wait. There are lots of steps that are necessary to make a project work. So the earlier you get started, particularly in this environment, the better off you're going to be. And to go back to your other question about the supply chains.
Sure.
That's a question better put to operating people than to me, but just based on my experience, I would say what it means is that when you make your estimates and when you do your pro formas and all of that, think conservative on cost and timelines, think conservative on revenue streams, and look at what you come up with, because realistically, people have ideas as to how to address this supply chain issue, but it's there with us, and we have to be realistic with our eyes open about it.
And I would add to that, I certainly agree with that. I would add to that that communities need to now be realistic about what the timeframes are for these types of builds, because of the supply chain issues, because of the large number of communities that are doing this now nationwide, the large number of these builds that are going, the typical grant that we see or the requirement we see is to have the city completed within 24 months. That is becoming more and more difficult when you're looking at maybe 6-month wait for conduit, or you're waiting for certain electronics that now have a lengthy wait, as well as finding the contractors and to get all that work done. People need to realize that it's not going to be as quick as it was 5 years ago to build a community.
Right. No, it was very important, if sobering and potentially disheartening point. I want to come back to some of the issues Jim raised at the top, and I sort of alluded to, and I want to come to with regards to Utopia. Jim, you sort of laid out the landscape where, Kansas City's on one end of the continuum. They welcome Google Fiber in. Google's kind of a overbuilder, if you will. They're building all new facilities, but private, completely private, versus the Kentucky wired scenario, a concessionaire, sort of operating, sort of on behalf of the state entity. And the piece that is linked to on this page about Utopia Fiber, and this was written 2 years ago, Roger. So I know I don't have your latest and greatest, but I've got sort of 3 examples of different ways. Even one entity, Utopia Fiber, has done, from Idaho Falls, where you basically are kind of building some expertise up there, but they're pretty much running things from their perspective. Woodland Hills, a small community in Utah County that wanted to own their own fiber project, but hired you to operate it effectively. And then Morgan, Utah, which is a rural community that I'm sure is built out by now, right? It was like one of those that was, and that's a more traditional model for Utopia Fiber. And just tell us a little bit about that. So let's hear from both Roger and Jim on this, and then I'd love to get Doc's final comments on that.
So just a little bit of repeat. One size doesn't fit all. Cities have their own desires. If they just say all I care is about checking one box, and that's speed, then maybe it's just a franchise agreement, and you work with someone like Google Fiber or something like that, right? You check the box for speed. But if you care about consumer privacy, if you care about competition, if you care about digital equity and digital divides and all, like, there's a whole bunch of other things that communities often care about. It's like, well, that's asking a lot, right? And you're not going to get some company to come in and build a network on their dime if you're putting all these requirements in there. And so it's a spectrum, right? If the more a city wants and dictates into a project, the more skin in the game they may need to have. And under our open access model, it's like, oh, you want open access? You're not going to get a private company to come in and finance and pay for and take all the risk for an open access infrastructure. So that's where the city comes in and participates in the financing of the infrastructure, but then they can still get what they want to out of it with the competition and consumer privacy and all this other things, and have the private companies come in and still benefit. So what's the right solution, right? You've got cities out there that which boxes are important to you. We try to promote the idea, if the public sector is involved, you probably want some of these other things. You shouldn't be in the business of picking winners and losers. But at the same time, if I were putting the hat on of a private company, it's like it's good to be in the monopoly, right? I don't want to do open access. I want every customer I can get for myself, and that's great if that company is taking on the risk and paying for the project. So with those ends of the spectrum, everything in the middle might work, depending on what the priorities are of that city.
Jim, what are your thoughts on the shared risk scenarios you sketched out? I mean, I know you're not going to say one is better than the other. That's part of the point you're raising, that everything is going to depend. But what are some of your thoughts on this? Kind of like, what factors might lead a city to want more involvement and control, and hence kind of taking on the risk, versus wanting to kind of offload that to the private partner?
Let me approach that from the perspective of the term asymmetric goals. What that means is that a community on the continuum we're talking about may be far along the path of wishing to encourage economic development or educational opportunity or outcomes that benefit the community over the long term. That community may be willing to invest long-term patient capital in a project that will produce those outcomes for the community. and at the same time be willing to cede short-term profits to some extent to the private provider or providers that it's dealing with. As I think all of us have said over the course of all of our responses, there's a continuum there, and finding the right blend is something that happens in the context of negotiation of individual agreements. And the private sector, I've found, is within certain levels of tolerance open to discussion on these points, as are communities. And it's just a matter of finding the sweet spot that works in that particular set of circumstances. Everybody's got to make some trade-offs of some kind. And it doesn't have to be absolute. You can build protections into the agreement between the parties so that there are ways to approach each entity's goals and get as close as possible. Beyond that, it's case by case, as far as I can tell.
Well, wonderful commentary. We have run to the end of our time, but I want to give Doc the last word on this question, which I do think gets to kind of the heart of what we've been talking about, which is how do you, as a private entity coming into a public-private partnership, value the risk, the reward? How do you look at it? And what advice would you give for all those broadband providers and communities listening in that may want to get a high-speed internet service in their community?
It's all about communication. It is all about the community, the municipality, and the public provider or the private provider sitting down and having that conversation about that community. It's about the community communicating with its citizens, with having forums, with meeting with business leaders, education leaders, public leaders, deciding what that community wants, where they want to be on that spectrum, who the potential partners are, and having those conversations. So it really is about communication. For us, we'd love to go into a community that has done that analysis, where they know what they want, and their wants happen to be what we provide. That is the best scenario that we can walk into. Walking into a community that hasn't really thought about it, and you're trying to help them solve the problem that they're not even sure that they have, is a tougher situation. So the community needs to do the self-analysis, and they need to work with somebody independently to determine that. And then we come in and we talk to people like that. But I have found that a lot of times when you're coming in after they've had a bad experience with current incumbent providers that provide various services, it's a lot harder coming into that situation, and if they have not done that analysis.
Well, that will have to be our last word. Remember that we will be back next Wednesday at 12 noon Eastern time with a discussion of when will the broadband maps get fixed. On behalf of Jim Baller, the partner at Keller and Heckman, Roger Timmerman, CEO of Utopia Fiber, and Doc Weininger of Allo Fiber, I'm Drew Clark, and thank you for being with us for this hour. Take care.
Thank you, Drew.